Hello, dear YouTube listener. This is Larry Graham. I want to say a few words about what you will be listening to if you decide to continue on here. This is a course of study. It's actually kind of a course of music appreciation that I created about 20 years ago for my class of pre-college students. I had just retired from the University of Colorado. I'd been there for 25 years. And was teaching, I think there were about 15 students that I had. They were very gifted and very advanced and had won lots of all the local awards, of course, and played with orchestras, but also some national, even a couple of international competitions. They went on to study at major universities back east, or in one case Stanford, and a few did go on into music. A couple of were at Juilliard, for example. They were very advanced and wonderful pianists, but I had the feeling that they were somewhat limited in their musical awareness. I wanted to acquaint them with all the other great stuff. I call this, therefore, the legacy of great music, and I divided it up into 4 different categories other than piano or piano concertos. And those categories, as you will hear soon, are orchestral music, vocal music, chamber music, and concertos other than piano concertos, mostly violin concertos. So the comments that I make on this course of study were designed for these younger students, but I think they're totally appropriate for anybody. I often comment about how knowing this music would apply and help their understanding of their own piano study, but you don't have to be a pianist to enjoy what I'm doing here. One other point that perhaps I should say to clarify is that on occasion I make a mention of a certain person, Crystal. Well, that's Crystal Lee. She was a former student of mine at CU, went on to do graduate work at Indiana University, and was teaching here in Boulder. Very, very fine teacher, very, very good pianist and musician. And we often shared a lot of students. If I were out of town on some sort of a trip, she could take over. So most of my students knew who she was, and that's occasionally I mention her, and so that shouldn't be confusing to you. So now I will hand this project over to the Larry Graham of 20 years ago. I begin with an introduction to the students, and then I tackle these, it's about 7 hours and 40 minutes of material, excerpts and commentary on a number of great works. I will break all this up into segments of about 20 minutes each. There should be about 20 of these segments if you continue listening to all of it. So you can do it in these shorter pieces, I think. Well, enjoy, and I think this could be very enriching.
Hello, dear students and friends. I'd like to begin this gift of several CDs by offering an introduction to why I'm doing this and what's going to be contained here. I'm entitling the gift, The Legacy of Great Music. Now, I've devoted 45 years of my life to a very serious study of this music, done a lot of performing, a lot of teaching, and it was all driven by a love for it. I want to share that experience and that love of music with you. Unfortunately, during the same 45 years, I've noticed a rather serious decline in the interest in and awareness of and appreciation of this great cultural legacy from Western Europe. The media virtually ignore it. The public-private schools do little or nothing to promote and foster it. How many of your schoolmates or friends, for example, have the slightest acquaintance with who Bach or Chopin or Brahms are? Well, perhaps they've heard of Mozart and Beethoven. Maybe they've heard of them, but do they actually ever listen to their music? But yet, music is omnipresent. It's everywhere. You can't avoid it. It's just that the stuff that we hear in our culture is second and third-rate music, often 10th-rate music. What I have in mind are TV jingles, Muzak that you hear in the shopping malls or restaurants, and then all kinds of trendy popular music that appeals to the lowest common denominator: rock music, hip-hop, rap music, country western. This is music written just to sell, to make money, and to appeal to a very low common denominator, I hate to say. It's catchy, it's trendy. A few months after it's popular, it fades out and something else comes in its place. I find that kind of music very objectionable. There are other kinds of popular music that are not so objectionable at all. They may even serve a very useful function in society. I'm thinking of things like patriotic music, church music, ethnic folk music, and there's some very admirable kinds of popular music that are written by talented people, Broadway show tunes, movie scores. Jazz is a good example. It takes a lot of talent to do that stuff. It just bothers me that the very greatest of all this music is so ignored and is dwindling. So one of the things I want to do in these tapes is be an advocate for the greatness of this music. Music appeals to different parts of our person. The Greeks felt that it definitely could affect your character. And if so, I'm a little concerned about what kind of character we're producing here in the United States. I think that the great music is much more challenging and ennobling. The other stuff can be very entertaining, but it doesn't require a lot from the listener. You just sort of sit back and you're entertained. That's the culture we're in, unfortunately, to a certain extent anyway. I just think something is terribly wrong in a culture that glorifies mediocre kinds of music and that argues that everybody's taste is just as good as everybody else's, and that all cultural legacies deserve to be honored equally. This is the argument of multiculturalism, that diversity should take precedence over a bunch of old, dead European white male composers. And I beg to differ. I think that you can argue why one kind is more elevating than another, why it's greater than another. Now, when I was growing up, 45 years ago, in the 1950s, I grew up in a small Oklahoma town, and I feel like the situation was quite a lot better for classical music in those days. In our small town, 15,000, Ada, Oklahoma, we had a concert series. There were probably 50 small towns in Oklahoma that were part of this concert series. There were probably 150 in Texas and maybe 20 or 30 in Colorado at that time. It was all over the United States. It was run by a big New York management, and they would send out, we would hear 4 or 5 or 6 times a year, very excellent professional performers would come through on a concert tour, play in usually the local high school auditorium. We got to hear live music. That series is completely defunct now. I actually first fell in love with classical music hearing it in the public schools. I don't think the public schools do anything to foster it these days. And there were several radio stations that I could always tune into in those days. And there's one FM station now in Denver that does classical music. That's it. And there's, of course, there's never anything on the television. In fact, in my day, there were only 3 channels: ABC, NBC, CBS. But one of them, I believe it was CBS, every Saturday morning had the New York Philharmonic on. Not cartoons. It was the New York Philharmonic with Leonard Bernstein. It was called the Young People's Concerts. And it was very educational, very, very useful. We don't have that anymore. So I do feel like things have deteriorated quite a lot. Now, to balance the picture, this is very nice and very, very hopeful, is that the European countries still do honor and respect it's their cultural legacy, I suppose, so maybe they would be more apt to do that. But I think the Eastern Asian countries, particularly Korea and China and Japan, it's not their cultural legacy, but they certainly have taken to it. They certainly recognize the greatness of that music. And it just bothers me that here in America we have dismissed it so very much. So I want to be an advocate, and that's one of the reasons that I'm doing these tapes. Another reason is it's partly educational. We spend a lot of time in your lessons, and you're becoming quite familiar with one type of classical music, which we would say is solo piano. We could lump piano concertos into that. So you're becoming quite familiar with the main composers and their music, maybe a little bit of the history of it. But there are other kinds of classical music that you're probably completely unfamiliar with, and that's the other reason that we're doing this. I want to introduce you to this great stuff that's not solo piano music. Now, there are 4 other genres that we're going to be looking at. Those 4 are, in the order that we'll take them, orchestral music, concertos other than piano concertos. A third type is chamber music, and the last will be vocal music. And what we'll do is we will go chronologically. So you'll get 4 tours, 4 music history tours, starting with the earliest great stuff, which, in my opinion, is always going to begin with Johann Sebastian Bach as a representative of the Baroque period. There was a lot of music written before that. There was medieval music. There was Renaissance music. I just think that music was too undeveloped during those days to really be great. Some people would disagree with me on that, but my opinion is that really, truly magnificent masterpiece type music begins with Bach. So we'll always begin with Bach. He's the master, and we'll proceed through the classical composers, the romantic composers. We won't actually encounter any impressionist music here, simply because Debussy and Ravel are the 2 main composers, and they're primarily piano composers, so they don't really come up as much in the other genres. And then we'll have a smattering of 20th century. So that's the way I'm got it set up, and that's my introduction. Let's begin now.